The wind carried snow sideways across the barren prairie, like a land forgetting its own borders. And Harlan Crow moved through it, like a man half remembered by the world. The house behind him had long since stopped groaning in protest when the cold crept in. Its boards had accepted the silence, just as Harlan had. Snow pressed against the cabin walls and iced over the window panes, blurring the shapes inside, though there wasn't much to blur. Just a fire running low. A girl too small for the rocking chair she sat in, and a man too broken to admit how lonely he'd become. Somewhere beneath that roof, in a drawer almost never opened, was a letter no one had read. The only thread still holding the day together was routine. Harlan's coat, a thick patched thing with canvas shoulders and wool lining, offered little warmth, but it carried the scent of horses and firewood, and something of his late wife's lavender still clung to the collar. He walked the fence line each morning and evening, not for the sake of the cattle. There hadn't been enough to call it a herd in 2 years, but because walking the land kept him from slipping under the ice of memory. He moved steady through the snow, boots crunching hard crust, rifle over one shoulder, eyes half-lidded against the wind. It wasn't age that bent his back, but something heavier. Grief never properly spoken, loneliness never quite named. He didn't speak to the world, and the world didn't ask anything of him. That was their agreement. Back at the house, the smoke curled thin from the chimney. Inside, the fire had burned down to coals. Nora Crow, no more than 6, sat curled in the oversized rocker with a rag doll stitched together from her mother's old nightdress. The child watched the door as if expecting something. Not her father. He always came back. But something else, maybe. A sound. A face. A change in the stillness. Her eyes, though young, held the patience of the bereaved. A quiet understanding that joy sometimes took its time, if it came at all. Harlan entered without knocking. Not that there was anyone to knock for. He stomped snow from his boots, shook the flakes off his coat, and set the rifle against the wall. The air shifted with his presence, but he said nothing. He nodded once to Nora. She gave him a tiny smile. He tried to return it, but it came out more like a twitch, crooked and uncertain. The kind of expression that had to be dragged through muscle memory. He stirred the fire with the old iron poker, tossed in a log, and watched the flames flare up like something startled. The room warmed slightly, but not enough to erase the cold in his bones. In the pantry, an old apron still hung by a rusted nail. It hadn't been worn in 2 winters, but no one had taken it down. It was Miriam's, his wife's, and the smell of her clung faintly to the fraying cotton. Lavender, rosemary, something floral and forgotten, the kind of scent that felt like a memory holding its breath. They ate supper without speaking. Thin stew, mostly potato and carrot, and a wedge of cornmeal bread. The spoons clinked against enamel bowls. Nora dipped her bread into her broth with quiet grace. Harlan watched the window. Nothing out there but wind and dark, but he watched it anyway. Later, with Nora tucked into bed and her doll curled in beside her, Harlan sat by the front window at the small desk made from barnwood. The oil lamp cast a soft golden circle on the warped floorboards. He opened the drawer beneath the desk and pulled out the letter. The paper was yellowed and creased in 4 perfect folds. The ink, brown with age, had not faded. He read it again, not because he expected the words to change, but because he always hoped the man who wrote them would seem more like a stranger. Dear Miss, my name is Harlan Crow. I am a widower with 1 daughter. I live near Juniper Hollow, 2 miles south of the old Chapel Road. I do not seek a servant, nor a saint. Just someone kind, someone who don't mind quiet. He had written it late one night, a week after the frost took Miriam, just after Nora's birth. The house had groaned in the wind then, too. He remembered the feel of his fingers around the pen. Stiff, unfamiliar. He hadn't written since his army days. He folded the letter again and placed it back in the drawer without a sigh. A sigh would have been too much like hope. Outside, the wind howled as if mourning something. It was well past midnight when Mosby barked, a short, surprised sound from the barn. The dog had been half-deaf for years, but when he barked, it meant something had disturbed what was left of his instinct. Harlan sat up in bed, the familiar ache in his joints sharpening with the cold. He pulled on his boots and coat, grabbed the lantern from its hook, and stepped out into the storm. The barn sat maybe 30 paces from the house, just past the line of cottonwoods. Snow crunched beneath his feet, and the lantern swung in the dark, casting long shadows across the drifts. Mosby circled the door, tail low, whining softly. Harlan eased it open, expecting a downed beam or a restless mare. Instead, he found someone. She was curled in the corner, half buried under a wool blanket that had once belonged to his brother. The lantern's light caught her face, pale, wind-chapped, and too calm to be surprised. She blinked up at him, not startled, just worn. "I'll go," she whispered, voice cracked from cold and silence. "You know this is my barn?" he asked, stepping inside. She nodded. "Didn't mean to trespass, just needed out of the wind." Her coat was thin, gloves frayed, boots clotted with snow. A satchel sat beside her, the leather cracked and tied shut with a belt. She looked like she had walked through the last 3 counties on borrowed strength. "What's your name?" "Evelyn Pike." "You from town?" "No." Her hands rested in her lap, folded neat. "Came on the train. Got off 2 days ago. Been walking since." "Where were you headed?" She looked up at him then. Her eyes were tired but steady. "I was looking for Harlan Crow." He stared. The lantern flickered in his grip. For a moment, he thought the wind had tricked his ears. "You found him." She nodded, as if that made sense. "I had a letter," she said. "From him. From you. Said you needed someone kind." Harlan's throat worked around something that wasn't quite a word. "I never sent it." She offered a small, crooked smile. "Maybe the Lord did." The words hovered between them, soft and strange. He didn't know what to say to them. "I'll move on at first light," she said, brushing straw from her skirt. "Just needed a place warm enough to keep breathing." "No call to sleep out here," he said after a long pause. "Come inside. There's stew left and a fire." She glanced up, startled for the first time. "I don't want to trouble you." "You're already here," he said, softer now. "Might as well come in out the cold." She gathered her things, satchel, blanket, and followed him through the snow. Mosby trotted beside her, loyal to warmth wherever it lived. The house welcomed them not with warmth, but with the memory of it. He gave her his chair by the fire and poured her a bowl of stew. She ate slowly, with quiet gratitude, not ravenous, just steady, like someone used to stretching what little she had. When the bowl was empty and the silence between them had thickened into something almost calm, he showed her to the spare room, the one that used to be his wife's, the one with the rocking horse carved by his brother. He didn't explain. She didn't ask. "Thank you," she said simply, setting her satchel down. He nodded. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the wind slowed. The silence still ran deep, but not hollow. Somewhere down the hall, another soul was breathing. Not beside him, but near enough to matter. For the first time in 2 long winters, Harlan Crow didn't dream of the grave. He dreamed of footsteps arriving instead of leaving. "Come inside," Harlan said, voice hoarse from the cold. "You're already here. Might as well get warm." Before dawn broke, Evelyn Pike was already lacing her boots, as if to prove she could leave before anyone asked her to. The house was quiet, steeped in that pale, breathless stillness that comes just before the frost lets go. A little light burned in the hearth, its coals shifting now and then, like a sleeper turning in a dream. Harlan stood in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, watching her. She hadn't touched the bread he'd left on the table, or the chipped tin cup of well water beside it. Her satchel leaned against the leg of the chair. The blanket was already rolled tight, her coat buttoned to the throat. He'd seen that look before, on wild animals cornered kindly. Not because someone aimed to hurt them, but because kindness was always the first lie in a string of disappointments. She looked up when he didn't speak. "I'll be on my way," she said. The laces pulled tight beneath her fingers. "Didn't mean to overstay." "Where would you go?" She hesitated, shrugged. "There's always somewhere." But it was the kind of shrug that barely moved her shoulders, a motion almost imagined. He saw it for what it was, the practiced answer of someone who'd run out of places long ago. Outside, the frost was melting in patches. Earth peeked through like bruises in the snow. Crows sat quiet in the cottonwoods, black eyes alert. The wind had changed. Less bite, more breath. "There's coffee," Harlan said finally. "If you want it." She blinked, and her hands stilled. Then, with the grace of someone who never expected the invitation, she nodded once. The satchel stayed where it was. By the time Nora rose, rubbing sleep from her eyes and clutching her doll, Evelyn was already pouring coffee into enamel mugs, the smell rich and bitter in the room. The child blinked at her in surprise, her lips parting slightly. "Good morning," Evelyn said. Soft, but not uncertain. Nora didn't answer at first, just looked at her. Then, slow as sun melting ice off the eaves, she nodded back. Harlan placed 3 plates instead of 2. No one mentioned it. The storm outside softened to lazy flurries by noon. A slow day, but full. Harlan took to fixing the back gate that had begun leaning southward in the last thaw. Evelyn followed without speaking, carrying a box of nails and a small wooden mallet. She moved like someone who didn't need instruction, only permission. Her coat was still thin, but she kept her hands wrapped in clean cloth and moved with the quiet efficiency of someone used to making herself useful without drawing notice. She held the gate steady while he braced the hinges. When the board split beneath the weight, she fetched another without asking. Her silence wasn't avoidance, it was patience, not the kind that waited for thanks, but the kind that didn't require it. Later, with the work done and Nora playing with her doll on the porch, Evelyn sat on the edge of the steps and watched the trees. Her eyes followed the wind in their branches. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Harlan joined her, the old wood groaning beneath his weight. "How'd you come by that letter?" he asked, voice low. She didn't look at him, just let her fingers trace the grain of the porch railing. "Found it in a paper bundle," she said. "Woman at the agency in St. Louis handed it over. Said a man named Crow had written in, but never heard back. Figured maybe the reply got lost." "You thought to come all this way without hearing from me?" Evelyn nodded. "Didn't have much left where I was." The wind stirred the branches again. "I worked at a dry goods store," she said after a pause. "Owner's wife took sick. He asked me to help more. Then he asked for other things." Her voice didn't tremble, but it narrowed. "I said no. Lost the job. Lost the room, too. Wasn't many places left to be." Harlan didn't speak, just stared out at the yard, then gestured toward the horizon. "This place isn't much, either." She gave the faintest smile, lips barely lifting. "It's honest. That's more than most." That night, Evelyn peeled potatoes by the hearth, humming under her breath. Nora sat beside her, head leaning against her arm, chattering the way only children do when the silence doesn't feel dangerous anymore. Harlan watched from his chair, the coffee in his hands going cool. Something inside him shifted. Not a blaze, just a flicker. After supper, while the dishes dried in a rack made from wire and nails, Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked up. Would it be all right if I stayed through the storm? The question came quiet. No pretense, no strategy. He nodded. You can stay as long as you need. She didn't smile. Not really. But something about her shoulders dropped. Not from defeat, but from release. And that was answer enough. The days that followed held no fanfare, no declaration. Just a rhythm that settled in like new snow. Silent, soft, and full. Evelyn folded Nora's blankets with a gentleness that seemed born from memory. She lit the lamp each evening before dusk. She never took the last piece of bread. She never tried to be Miriam. She moved through the house like someone who saw the ghosts, and walked around them respectfully. Nora began calling her Miss Evelyn. No one told her to. Sometimes, Harlan caught the girl watching Evelyn with a look too old for her small face. A look that said, maybe this is what it's supposed to feel like. There was laughter now and then. Sudden, unsure, like the house forgot how to echo it. But it stayed longer each time. One morning, as Harlan returned from town with seed and a coil of fence wire, he found Evelyn sitting on the porch with a book open in her lap. Nora lay curled at her feet, eyes wide. Listening to the cadence of the story. Not the words, but the voice that made them soft. Harlan paused before stepping inside. Evelyn looked up, met his gaze, and didn't look away. That evening, after Nora was asleep, the fire was low but steady. Harlan poured 2 cups of coffee and offered her one. She took it. You were married before? He asked. She shook her head. He waited. A teacher. Said he wanted a simple life. Then said I was too plain. Said I'd aged too quick. She shrugged. Left before the bans were posted. Harlan's jaw clenched. He was a fool. Maybe, she said. Or maybe he just wanted something I never was. They sat in silence, the kind that doesn't demand words. The truth is, he said after a long while, I never expected to feel much of anything again. She didn't answer, just held the cup a little tighter in her hands. That was enough. The days passed in that rhythm. Not easy, but steady. A thaw came. Then more snow. Evelyn stayed. No one asked her to. No one asked her not to. But the house changed shape around her. The silence grew softer, the meals richer, the air warmer. One night, as Harlan passed the door to Nora's room, he stopped. Inside, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, brushing the child's hair. She was singing something low and lilting, with the cadence of prayer. The firelight from the hall touched her face, and Harlan closed his eyes. Later, in the kitchen, Evelyn folded laundry beside him. I've stayed longer than I meant to, she said. You're not in the way. I didn't come to be kept. She met his eyes. I came because I thought maybe I could be needed. He didn't blink, didn't look away. You are. She blinked once, then nodded. That night, Harlan found the old letter again. He read it once more. The words no longer felt like his. They belonged to a man crying out in the dark. But here he was, in the quiet glow of a fire he hadn't built alone. And outside, the wind did not howl. It whispered. That night, for the first time in months, the fire burned slow, not from habit, but from someone remembering to feed it. On a gray Tuesday, a rider appeared over the ridge, coat too fine for mud, eyes too sharp for kindness. The road into Juniper Hollow didn't take many visitors, not this time of year. The thaw had barely started its slow work, and the trail was still clotted with patches of slush and ice. From the porch of the Crow homestead, the land rolled away in soft humps of dirty snow and half-awakened earth, a quiet world stirring beneath the cold. Evelyn Pike was seated on the steps, stringing beans into a basket on her lap. Nora, her knees muddy and her hands full of rag-doll thread, lay on her stomach just beside her, humming nonsense to herself. Evelyn didn't stop her work when she saw the man approaching. Her fingers paused, then resumed. Her eyes, though, stayed fixed on him, watching the way he sat his saddle, upright, unhurried, as if the land owed him space. Behind the barn, Harlan Crow heard the distant clip of hooves and leaned back against the wall, shovel in hand. He didn't move right away, just let the sound settle in his ribs like a warning. The man dismounted with practiced grace. His boots touched the ground without sound, polished to an unnatural gleam for any man riding these trails. His coat, black wool lined in silver thread, looked Eastern. His face, though sharp with age, was too well kept for someone sleeping in stage stations or creekbed camps. And his smile, it was the kind a man practiced in mirrors. Easy. Empty. "Evelyn," he said, voice like a coin flipped in a dead room. She didn't smile, didn't rise. "I wondered if you were still breathing," she replied, flat as fieldstone. The man, Elias Varn, touched the brim of his hat, but didn't remove it. "Didn't expect to find you all the way out here," he said. "I didn't leave a map." His eyes moved over the place, to the garden beds still resting under frost, to the windows of the house where curtains now hung in tidy folds, then to the child, now sitting up, her small hand curling around the edge of Evelyn's skirt. "You have a daughter now?" he asked. "She's mine," Evelyn said sharply, her voice sharpening like a blade finding its edge. "She's been mine since the day she wrapped her arms around my neck and didn't ask what I'd done wrong to be alone." Nora stood, her chin lifted, eyes unsure. Evelyn reached down and laced her fingers through the girl's. Elias's smile wavered. "I made mistakes," he said. "You were right to be angry." "You never cared whether I was angry," Evelyn replied. "Only whether I stayed quiet." He exhaled and glanced back toward his horse, then toward the barn, and finally, to the man now walking slowly up the path toward the house. Harlan came like weather does, silent but certain. There was no threat in his gait, no heat in his jaw, just a kind of groundedness, like the earth knew him by name. "You married him?" Elias asked. "Yes," Evelyn answered before Harlan could. "I have better now." Elias cocked his head. "You deserve fire, Evelyn, not ash. A man with spirit, not one who's spent his years burying it." That was when Harlan stopped. He didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for the axe still leaning by the woodpile. He just looked at the man and let the silence speak first. "She doesn't need fire," he said. "She needs steadiness and peace." Evelyn stepped forward, letting Nora slip behind her. "Elias," she said, voice quiet but full, "you didn't come to win me back. You came to see if I was still breakable." She waited a breath. "I'm not." And something in her posture, in the way her chin lifted and her voice didn't shake, made the polished man pause. Just for a breath, just long enough to know she was right. Elias tipped his hat again, this time slower, with less of that silver thread charm. "Well," he said, "it seems you've built something out of all that ruin, after all." Then he mounted, and left. No protest, no plea, just hoofbeats fading into the thawing land. They didn't speak for a long while after. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, shaking loose a last few frozen leaves. Nora pressed close to Evelyn's side and looked up, wide-eyed. Evelyn stooped and scooped her into her arms, pressing her lips to the girl's forehead. Inside, the fire was burning low again. The cabin smelled of pine pitch and old iron. Evelyn stood at the window, watching the last dust of Elias's departure lift into the pale sky. Harlan entered a few minutes later, shook off his coat, and reached for a match. "You all right?" he asked. Evelyn didn't answer right away, just nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "More than I expected to be." Later, after the supper dishes had been scrubbed and stacked on the wooden shelf, Harlan found her near the back window again, shoulders drawn, but not tense. He stepped beside her and said nothing, just stood. The window showed only the edge of the world, trees, snow, and the broken trail beyond it. He always had a way of finding cracks, she said after a time, her voice more tired than bitter. Harlan didn't speak. He moved to the fire, added another log, and gently pressed it into place, the flames rising with a soft sigh. He always had a way of finding cracks, she whispered later, standing by the fire. Harlan didn't reply, just reached for another log, and gently set it down between the flames. The sky hadn't yet broken from black to blue when Harlan Crow saddled his mare and rode toward Juniper Hollow, like a man trying to outrun hesitation. The cold bit sharp at his face as he left the homestead behind. Each breath hung in the air like ghosts watching him ride. The mare's hooves struck hard against the frozen ruts in the trail, each sound echoing a little too loud in the silence. He hadn't bothered to eat, hadn't even lit the fire before leaving. The house behind him still held the warmth of sleep, of a child curled beneath quilts, of a woman sitting quiet by the window the night before, saying nothing and saying everything. He hadn't answered her then, not really. And now, he couldn't rest with the knowing that she might leave come morning. In the dim light, the trail into town felt longer than it ever had. He passed old cottonwoods with trunks bowed like tired elders. He crossed the shallow stream near Elk's Run, ice still gripping the edges. The town crept up on him slow, roofs barely visible in the haze of cold dawn. He didn't stop to greet anyone, didn't nod at the baker hauling wood, or at young Matthew Jost trying to kick his frozen wagon wheel loose. He rode straight past the shuttered mercantile, past the old blacksmith's forge, and toward the little chapel tucked on the edge of the ridge, where the grass had yet to fight its way through the crust of snow. The Reverend answered on the second knock, coat pulled half on, hair askew. "I need a ceremony," Harlan said. The Reverend blinked, then rubbed his face, as if trying to be sure he wasn't dreaming. "Before the sun rises." "Anyone else know about this?" the Reverend asked, squinting. "Not yet." The old man studied him a moment, then nodded. "Give me 5 minutes." By the time Harlan rode back toward the homestead, the world had begun to color. The deep black of night had thinned into a muted indigo, and frost blinked on the fence rails like scattered diamonds. Inside the cabin, Evelyn was up, fully dressed. Her hair was braided, her satchel back at her feet, coat buttoned, hands folded around a cup that had gone cold. When he entered, she turned. Her eyes scanned him, first his face, then his hands, then the small box he set down on the table. "You leaving now?" he asked. "I figured it best," she said, voice even, not bitter, not sharp, just resigned. "I went to town," he said, tapping the box once with his fingers. She didn't reach for it, just looked at him, waiting. "I don't have a speech," Harlan said. "I'm not good with feelings. But I know this. You showed up when I didn't think anything good ever would again. You mended more than clothes. You mended this place. You mended me." Her lips parted, but no words came. He went on, slow and plain. "I don't want to ask you to stay because I'm lonely. I want to ask because I finally see what's been standing in front of me. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what we might have had if I'd kept my mouth shut." She opened the box. Inside was a silver ring, plain, polished, honest. "You sure?" she whispered, eyes glinting in the rising light. "I've never been more." She stood there a long time, then bent and set her satchel gently down. "I'm not perfect," she said. "Neither am I. I scare easy. I'll wait. I need more than shelter, Harlan. I'll give what I can. Every day." Their hands met in the quiet. From down the hall, small footsteps padded against the floorboards. Nora emerged, hair tangled from sleep, her doll crooked in her elbow. She blinked at the two of them. "Is Mama leaving?" she asked, voice small. Evelyn froze. Nora didn't correct herself. She just walked forward and wrapped her arms around Evelyn's waist. The silence between the three of them held something holy. Evelyn looked up, blinking fast, breath hitching. "She's not going anywhere," Harlan said softly. No church bells rang when they made the ride into town. No one lined the streets or tossed rice or flower petals. It was just them, a man, a woman, and a child, seated between them on the saddle, her feet not reaching the stirrups, her head resting against Evelyn's shoulder. The chapel sat small and quiet, tucked into the edge of the pine line where the snow still lingered in shade. The Reverend waited with his lantern, his coat now buttoned, his eyes bleary but kind. There were no pews filled, no voices raised, just vows spoken with cracked hands held together, and a fire in the hearth whispering like a witness. The Reverend's voice was low. "Do you come here by your own will?" "Yes." "Do you vow to walk beside each other? Not ahead, not behind?" "Yes." "Do you promise not what is perfect, but what is real?" "Yes." When Harlan looked at Evelyn and said, "I choose you because you saw me when I forgot I was worth seeing," she cried without sound, her nod trembling through her whole body. The Reverend gave them his blessing with no fanfare, only a nod and the closing of a small leather book tied with string. They left the chapel hand in hand, Nora skipping ahead, snow crunching beneath her boots. The light over the ridge was breaking now, gold streaking the sky like something remembered. A new day, unclaimed. On the wagon ride home, Evelyn cradled Nora as she slept, her small fingers tangled in Evelyn's shawl. Harlan drove slow, letting the moment stretch. He didn't look over at Evelyn yet. He didn't have to. He just held the reins with steady hands and let the road rise up beneath them. The house welcomed them without ceremony, but not without warmth. He hung his coat. She set the kettle on. Nora curled back beneath her quilt with barely a murmur. The quiet that settled into the cabin wasn't hollow. It was sacred. He brought her a cup of tea. She took it, their fingers brushing. No spark, no jolt, just warmth. The day passed without announcement, without proclamation. But everything had changed. Later, Harlan found her on the porch, shelling beans with her skirts tucked beneath her knees. She looked up. "Was it foolish?" she asked. "To marry before we knew what would come?" He shook his head. "Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is believe in what's growing before you see the fruit." She smiled. Small, but it stayed. That night, Evelyn tucked Nora in, brushing her hair back from her face. Harlan stood in the doorway. "She called you Mama," he said. "I heard. How'd it feel?" Evelyn glanced down at the sleeping girl, then back at him. "Like something I don't deserve. But something I want to protect, all the same." He stepped into the room, placed a hand against her back. "We'll earn it. All of us." They moved together into the hall, lamps low, the air rich with the quiet scent of supper and pine wood. He poured her tea. She took it without hesitation. "I meant it," he said. "When I told you this place needed you." She met his eyes. "And I meant it when I stayed." The wind rose behind them as they stepped outside, but it didn't bite. It carried the warmth of a morning that belonged only to them. They moved through town before the rooster crowed, their breath rising like smoke from prayer candles. A man, a woman, and a child, quiet as ghosts, but alive. The town still slept, blanketed in that hush between dark and dawn, where the sky was not black, not blue, but something in between. Horses in their stalls shifted but did not stir. No windows lit, no doors cracked open. Juniper Hollow had not yet noticed what was unfolding within it, and perhaps that made it all the more sacred. The wagon creaked beneath them, iron rims brushing softly against frost-hardened dirt. Nora, wrapped in her Sunday shawl, dozed between them, head against Evelyn's shoulder. Harlan held the reins, his hand steady though his breath came slow, like he was still finding the rhythm of it all. The chapel at the ridge was just as it had been the morning he asked for the Reverend, silent, weather-worn, and somehow waiting. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and old paper. Light from the Reverend's lantern cast long shadows against the wooden floor. The benches were empty, pew cushions worn to fabric skin and memory. A single crucifix hung at the front, made of driftwood, polished smooth by generations of reverence. Evelyn stood still as they entered, one hand gently guiding Nora forward. She wore her plain blue dress, the hem letting in the cold. Around her shoulders, she had wrapped the thick wool shawl that once belonged to Harlan's late wife. It did not fit like something borrowed. It fit like something repurposed with care, not to erase, but to continue. Harlan touched the brim of his hat. The Reverend gave a quiet nod. No words passed between them until they stood before the altar. Evelyn's hand clasped lightly in Harlan's, Nora's small form lingering by the front row, watching with wide eyes, quiet as the empty church. The ceremony was brief, but not rushed, the kind of brief that comes from not needing to say more than what's true. "Do you come here by your own will?" the Reverend asked. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Do you vow to walk beside each other? Not ahead? Not behind?" "Yes," Harlan replied. "Do you promise not what is perfect, but what is real?" Their voices were quiet, but they didn't waver. The Reverend looked at each of them in turn. "Then speak what you would, and let it be witnessed." Harlan turned slightly, eyes settling on Evelyn. The shadows caught in the grooves of his face, but they didn't hide him. "I choose you," he said, each word deliberate, carved from a place deeper than memory. "Because you saw me when I forgot I was worth seeing." Evelyn's lips parted. But no words came, just a soft breath and tears that filled her eyes without spilling. She nodded, her whole body saying yes, even if her mouth could not. The Reverend closed his book, the leather cracked, string worn thin from years of ceremony and prayer. "Then by truth and by witness may you go forward as one." No ring, no bouquet, no music. Just the soft echo of the Reverend's footsteps as he stepped back, and the sigh of wood as the wind passed through the eaves. Evelyn bent to gather Nora's hand. The girl took it without question, as if she had always belonged there, as if she had always known how the story should end. They stepped out into the morning together, three shadows stitched into the gold light of the rising sun. The sky blazed soft lavender, a quiet kind of triumph. Back in the wagon, Nora sat between them again, humming something under her breath that might have been one of Evelyn's lullabies, or might have been a new tune altogether. Evelyn leaned slightly into Harlan's side, her hand still tucked beneath the folds of his coat, not from cold, but because it had found its place. They didn't speak on the ride home. They didn't need to. The wind moved gently now, not harsh like winter's bite, but like the whisper of something changing. The earth, though still locked in frost, seemed ready to shift. Birds began to murmur from the trees. The fence lines looked less like boundaries and more like threads waiting to be repaired. The house greeted them without drama. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the front steps bore the tiny footprints of Nora's earlier games. Inside, the warmth held. Harlan hung his coat by the door and helped Evelyn down from the wagon. She carried Nora, who was already dozing, and laid her gently back into her bed beneath the same patchwork quilt Evelyn had folded just days before. The girl stirred, murmured something, then fell deeper into sleep, cheeks pink from wind and excitement. Evelyn stayed beside her for a time, brushing hair from her brow with the backs of her fingers. Harlan stood in the doorway, watching not just the gesture, but the steadiness of it, the care, the kind of care that doesn't announce itself. Later, Evelyn sat in the armchair, her boots unlaced, the shawl pulled tighter around her shoulders. She didn't look at Harlan as he poured tea, but he saw the way her fingers trembled just a little as she accepted the cup. Was it foolish, she asked, staring into the dark steam, to marry before we knew what would come? Harlan shook his head. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is believe in what's growing before you see the fruit. She let out a breath, almost a laugh. A small one, she said, but it stayed. He watched her for a while, then stepped away, tending the fire, adding a split log, settling it just right. The flames crackled up, soft and golden. Evelyn joined him in the kitchen. Her hands moved on instinct, wiping down the counter, setting out bread for morning, straightening the tin of salt. She didn't speak again until she turned toward the hallway. "She called me Mama," she said, voice low. "I know," Harlan said. "How did it feel?" Evelyn looked toward the door of the girl's room, half open, soft lamplight spilling through like a promise. "Like something I don't deserve," she said, "but something I want to protect, all the same." Harlan moved toward her, placed a steady hand on the curve of her back. "We'll earn it, all of us." They stood like that for a long while, listening to the old house breathe. The fire snapped once, sending a curl of ember dancing up into the chimney. When the lamps were low, and Nora slept, and the air inside the cabin carried only peace, Harlan poured one more cup of tea and handed it to Evelyn. She took it without hesitation. He sat across from her, their knees almost touching. "I meant it," he said. "When I told you this place needed you." She nodded, eyes on the fire. "And I meant it when I stayed." The wind rose behind them as they stepped outside, but it didn't bite. It carried the warmth of a morning that belonged only to them. Spring came sudden, in thunder, in mud, in green things clawing back into the world, like they'd never left. Rain battered the hills of Juniper Hollow in hard sheets, turning dust to river and trails to slush. It was the kind of storm that shook window panes and made even the oldest trees bow low, their limbs bending under the weight of memory. Lightning crackled over the ridge like sky-born whips, and thunder rumbled deep in the soil like it was waking something buried. Inside the Crow homestead, it was warm and still. Nora whimpered in her sleep when the wind rattled the shutters. Evelyn rose before Harlan had even turned in the bed. Barefoot, she lit the lamp and moved down the hall, one hand steady on the wall for balance. She reached the child's room and knelt by the bed, brushing damp curls from the girl's forehead, humming low and tuneless until the storm inside and out began to settle. Harlan watched from the doorway, silent, wrapped in the blanket from the foot of their bed. The image stayed with him, Evelyn's palm against Nora's brow, the hush in her breath, the steadiness in her spine. Later, when she returned to the sitting room, she curled beside him on the worn settee, her head on his shoulder, legs tucked beneath her like a cat seeking the warmest part of the room. He kissed her knuckles, slow and quiet, and neither of them said a thing for a long while. The storm shrieked beyond the walls, but inside, it couldn't reach them. "You know," she whispered, eyes barely open, "I think I was waiting my whole life to stop waiting." He didn't answer right away, just let the thought root down in the room like it had found soil. His thumb brushed her hand, back and forth, as if steadying both of them with the rhythm. "You were always meant to be found," he said finally. When morning came, the sky cracked open into a golden blue so pure it almost hurt to look at. The fields shimmered with new water, low pools stretching between the furrows Harlan had turned weeks ago. The air was soaked through with the scent of wet bark, turned earth, and wild grass just starting to show its pale green tips. Evelyn stood barefoot in the mud. her skirt clinging heavy around her ankles, head tilted toward the sun. The light kissed her collarbones and lined her brow like something sacred. Her hair, usually braided tight, hung loose for once, waving in the soft breeze as if spring itself had tugged the pins free. Nora danced around her in loops, chasing butterflies that hadn't been there yesterday. Her laughter rose in bursts, light and unbound. From the doorway, Harlan watched them, arms crossed loosely over his chest, leaning into the frame like a man finally believing in the future. The sight of them, mother and child, set against the rising sun and drenched earth, made something move in his chest he hadn't known was still alive. Evelyn turned and saw him watching. She smiled, not coy, not soft, but full of knowing, full of earned joy. He stepped down into the yard, boots squelching in the mud. She walked toward him without hesitation, her dress stained, her toes brown from earth, her heart unhidden. He opened his arms, and she stepped into them like she'd always belonged there. Inside the house, the air was thick with the smell of fresh bread and rosemary. Harlan had risen early, before the storm let go, and kneaded dough in the half-light. The scent clung to the rafters now, mixed with wood smoke and the sharp sweetness of early spring. Evelyn wiped her hands on a linen cloth, then set it by the sink. Nora's laughter echoed outside again, somewhere near the chicken coop. "She doesn't stop moving," Evelyn said, smiling as she brushed hair back from her temple. "She's got a lot of life to make up for," Harlan replied. They sat at the table, sharing coffee from mismatched cups. Neither said much, but they didn't need to. That was the kind of quiet they'd learned to keep between them, soft, not strained, full of meaning, not emptiness. Evelyn folded her hands around the mug, then looked toward the window. "I keep thinking it'll vanish," she said. "Like this life isn't really mine to keep." "You built it," he said, "with your own hands." She met his eyes. "But I came with nothing." He leaned forward, voice low. "You came with hope. That's more than most." The town had begun to take notice. Doc Eben Mallory, stopping by with a parcel of bandages and news from the trail, had muttered something about miracles being quieter than they used to be. Mrs. Tate from the milliners had sent over preserves, unasked. Even young Matthew Jost had started waving when he passed, instead of pretending he hadn't seen Harlan at all. But it was inside the house where the change was most felt. Nora, who once sat like a question unanswered, now moved with the certainty of children who are loved. She hummed Evelyn's lullabies while sweeping crumbs from the table, never asking whose song it had been first. Harlan found his gloves laid near the stove each morning, warm and waiting, and Evelyn, who once lingered near the door like she might still be asked to leave, now moved through the cabin like someone who had planted roots without realizing it. The nights were softer now, not because there was no pain left, but because there was company in bearing it. Then one evening, as the sun settled low behind the ridge and the wind returned with the scent of blooming sage, Evelyn stood at the window, hands resting on the sill, her eyes distant. Harlan moved up behind her, quiet, familiar. "You all right?" She nodded, but didn't speak. Outside, Nora chased fireflies with a jar in her hands. "I keep expecting him to come back," she said. "Elias?" She nodded again. "Not because he wants to win me, just to remind me I was breakable once." Harlan said nothing. He didn't have to. Instead, he stepped closer, placed his hand gently against her back, and let the silence between them speak. "I used to think I needed someone to chase me," Evelyn said, "to make me feel worth the effort." Harlan's brow creased, but he stayed still, listening. "But you," she continued, "you walk beside me, even when I say nothing, even when I fall quiet." She turned, looked up into his eyes. "That's love, isn't it? Not the rush, but the return." He nodded. "I never knew how to speak it," he said, "but I think I live it now." "I married you before dawn," she said, "because I was afraid you'd leave." He shook his head. "I married you because I'd lived so long with loss. I didn't know how to hold something without fearing it would slip through." She placed her palm against his chest. "And I stayed because you never asked me to be anything but who I was." He leaned into her touch, eyes closing for a breath. "I was a broken man," he whispered. "You were grieving," she replied. "And grief doesn't make you less. It makes you deeper." He opened his eyes. "You believe that?" "I live it." The quiet that followed was not empty. It was full of something ancient. Something tender. They kissed, not with desperation, not with fear, but with the steadiness of people who had already built something and were now learning to rest inside it. The fire crackled low as evening fell. As she turned toward him, muddy dress clinging to her ankles, he opened his arms. She went to him without hesitation, and for the first time, nothing in either of them held back. And so the story settles like dust after a long ride. Not loud, not quick, but steady. The kind of ending that doesn't slam the door, but leaves it ajar for the wind to wander through, soft with wildflower scents, and yesterday's voices carried on the breeze. You can still hear the creak of the porch boards where Evelyn once sat shelling beans, her skirts brushing her ankles, her eyes lifted not in question, but in presence, and the soft footfall of Nora trailing close behind, her laughter rising like birds startled from wheat fields at dawn. The house that once echoed hollow now breathes gently, not just with warmth, but with meaning. Every curtain edge and fire-warmed cup remembering hands that chose to stay, not because they were asked, but because they were seen. Harlan's boots still rest by the door, the leather cracked and flaking with years, but they no longer carry the weight of solitude. They carry the imprint of steps walked beside another. Not in front or behind, but beside. And maybe that's all a man ever needs to know he's made it home. The letter that was never sent sleeps now in the drawer where it began, faded and soft, but no longer aching. Its words answered not by post, but by breath and action, and a pair of frost-bitten hands that found their way through his storm. And the ghosts. Oh, the ghosts. They haven't left, but they've softened, no longer clinging to corners or woven into quilt seams, but passing peacefully through, nodding once at the woman who laid another quilt down without ever moving theirs. Sometimes it's the smallest sounds that linger longest, the brush of hair being combed at night, the hush of two voices sitting by firelight with nothing left to prove. The hush before vows are spoken not because of certainty, but because of courage. And maybe love isn't a thing you chase or stumble into or save. Maybe it's what happens when you stop running, when you hang your coat for the last time and find someone's already warmed your gloves. Maybe kindness isn't loud, doesn't need to be. It shows up in patched sleeves and warm bread, and the way a woman lays a hand on a child's back without being told to. And maybe honor doesn't live in medals or church ledgers, but in showing up again after everything inside you told you not to. Evelyn wasn't a heroine in the way stories like to name them, but maybe she was something better. The kind of woman who stays when staying is hardest, who doesn't ask for gratitude or reward, who carries her bruises under neat hair and steady hands, and never once lets them turn bitter. And Harlan, for all his silence, gave the rarest thing a man can offer. Not protection, not pride, but room to be oneself in full, in grief, in hope, in healing. And that little girl, Nora, she may not remember the sound of her mother's voice, but she will remember the feeling of being loved by someone who didn't have to, and maybe that's the kind of memory that lasts longer than songs. Spring always comes late to places like Juniper Hollow, but it comes, not with trumpet flowers or grand processions, but with wet earth and horses pawing softly at softened trails, and green poking through where no one expected it. And if you walk that ridge now, early in the morning, when mist still clings to the creek, you might see a woman standing barefoot in the mud, arms open to the sky, not because she's waiting for anything anymore, but because she knows she was found, and that is enough. This story doesn't end with a wedding or a storm or a spoken truth, but with something quieter. A porch lamp flickering to life before dusk, a child's giggle through the window, the hush of someone returning after a long day, and knowing they'll be met with warmth. Honor, yes, it can be buried. Beneath loss, beneath fear, beneath years. But it cannot be erased, not if one's soul remembers what it's meant to look like. Justice may come late, but when it comes in the form of mercy, of being chosen instead of chased, it still matters. The world may forget women like Evelyn, but they are the ones who hold it together when it most wants to fall apart. And the truth? Well, the truth doesn't need everyone to believe it, just one person willing to live by it. If you still believe in quiet love, in dignity that needs no fanfare, in the slow justice of living well despite all the wrongs, then leave a sign. Let your name be marked among those who still carry that old code, who still hear the whisper of horse hooves and wind chimes and prayers without words. If this story settled in your chest like a lantern warming from the inside, give it light with a gentle like. And if you wish to hear the next tale carried from the edges of forgotten places and good men who still walk with honor, subscribe to our channel and return when the night is quiet and the heart is open. For here, stories are not told for noise, but for remembering, and the philosophy remains. Sometimes all it takes to save a life is one soul willing to stay.